Okay, so let's have a look at another free response question. So here we have f being defined as a particular function, and it's e to the x cosine of x. We want the average rate of change, right? So our average rate of change is going to be f of b minus f of a all over b minus a. And in this case, that's going to be e to the pi cosine of pi minus e to the 0 cosine of 0 all over pi minus 0. Well, cosine of pi is 1, or excuse me, negative 1, and the cosine of 0 equals 1. So therefore, we're going to have negative e to the pi minus 1 all over pi. And that's a satisfactory answer. All right. So the slope of the line tangent to the graph, we're going to need to know f prime. F prime is going to be the product rule, which is going to be the first times the derivative of the second, plus the second times the derivative of the first. And we want to figure out the slope at x equals 3 pi over 2. So we have e to the 3 pi over 2 negative sine of 3 pi over 2 plus, all right, we're going to have e to the 3 pi over 2 times the cosine of 3 pi over 2. And we do have to evaluate these. And with our evaluation, the sine of 3 pi over 2, that's going to be negative 1. The cosine of 3 pi over 2, that's going to be 0. And so we will have a negative times a negative. So therefore, we know our slope is going to be e to the 3 pi over 2, some value. Okay, next, find the absolute minimum of f on the interval. So our justification really is working with the extreme value theorem. And on our interval from 0 to 2 pi, we need to figure out when our derivative is equal to 0. So f prime of x is equal to 0 if e to the x times negative sine of x plus cosine of x is equal to 0. So therefore, if let's go ahead and show the steps because you may not get this. So if the cosine of x is equal to the sine of x, so therefore at x equals pi over 4 or x equals 3 pi over 4. Okay, now we're going to continue our work for C kind of here on the side. So now we need to check the endpoints and we need to check the critical points. All right, so our endpoints for our x values were 0 and 2 pi, and our critical points were pi over 4 and 3 pi over 4. And then we want to figure out the value from f of x. So we come back up, we say, well, what was f of x? E to the x cosine of x. So e to the x cosine of 0, that was 1. E to the x cosine of 2 pi, that would be e to the 2 pi. E to the x cosine of pi over 4, that would be root 2 over 2 e to the pi over 4. And e to the x cosine of 3 pi over 4 would be negative root 2 over 2 e to the 3 pi over 4. So we're looking for the absolute minimum value, and that's going to be only this piece, this negative root 2 over 2 e to the, and I wrote 3 pi over 4, that's wrong, my apologies, that should be 5 pi over 4, all right, e to the 5 pi over 4. All right, the way that we know that is that in the first quadrant, sine and cosine are the same, but then also in the third quadrant, sine and cosine are the same. All right, so that'd be pi plus pi over 4, which would be 5 pi over 4. All right, and so we do that, and our justification, all right, is going to be by the extreme value theorem. Okay, and over here, let g be a differentiable function. The graph of g prime, the derivative is shown. Find the limit, okay, as x approaches pi over 2, or state that does not exist, justify your answer. So, what do we have? The limit as x approaches pi over 2 of f of x is, all right, so g prime, and we have f of x. Well, with pi over 2, that's going to be e to the pi over 2 cosine of pi over 2. So that's going to be 0. And the limit as x approaches pi over 2 of g of x is told that we is 0, so that's 0. So therefore, we need to try L'Hopital's rule. And if we use L'Hopital's rule, that tells us that we need to look at the limit as x approaches pi over 2 of f prime of x over g prime of x. All right, and the numerator, f prime, well, we found f prime earlier, and that's e to the x times negative sine of x cosine of x. So at pi over 2, cosine of x is 0, negative, so I'm going to have negative e to the pi over 2. And g prime of x at pi over 2, well, that's going to be approaching 2. So therefore, the limit as x approaches pi over 2 of f prime of x over g prime of x, which is our limit that we're looking for, and that's going to be negative 1/2 e to the pi over 2. Okay, and that is based on L'Hopital's rule. So L'Hopital's rule, very important that we get this information down. Very important that we never write equals 0 over 0. But rather we want to use our limit notation for each of these, right? And then talk about trying L'Hopital's rule, finding the value, and our final answer needs to include the limit notation. Okay. So what do we have otherwise? What do we have otherwise? Well, if we have our work here in terms of the points, right, the limit as x approaches to pi over 2 of g of x being equal to 0, we need to make sure that we have that. We need to make sure that we write L'Hopital's with the limit, and we need to make sure we have the final answer. So there's 3 points there. Okay. For part C, the points f prime of x is equal to 0. We need to make sure that we have that. X equals pi over 4 or 5 pi over 4. We need to make sure that we have that. And then our final answer with the justification. And for us, this candidates test, as it's called, candidates test, requires us to check the endpoints and requires us to check the critical points. And we need to find the values at each of those spots. And then for this one, it was minimum value, so we found the value. Right, so there's 3 points for part D. There happen to be 3 points for part C. All right. For the slope, we needed to find f prime correctly using the product rule. We needed to find the correct value. There was 2 points there. So that's a total of 8 points, which means that the average rate of change only has the answer point, but it must be supported by the work, and you'd have 1 point. Okay. So that's another free response question without a calculator. Please feel free to reach out as you have questions. Thank you for your time.